We had driven out early that afternoon, loaded up with coolers, tents, and the usual camping gear. My ex, her friend, and I had planned this trip for weeks. A break from the everyday grind, a few nights under the stars, a few beers around the fire. The campsite was one of those state park deals. Decent facilities, but isolated enough to feel like you were out in the wild. It was late summer, warm enough during the day, but with that familiar chill setting in as the sun dipped below the trees. We set up our tents side by side in a small clearing surrounded by thick brush and towering pines. By dusk, the fire was crackling, and we sat around it, beers in hand, the night settling in heavy and dark. The stars were out in full force, the kind of night sky you forget exists when you live in the city. Crickets chirped somewhere in the distance. We talked and laughed, passing stories back and forth. Then he showed up. He wasn't some rugged survivalist or grizzled old woodsman. No, this guy had the look of someone who had picked up a tent from Walmart and decided to play outdoorsman for the weekend. Khaki cargo shorts, a fleece jacket, hiking boots that looked too new. He just walked out of the woods like he had always been there. No warning, no approach. One second it was just the three of us, and the next he was there. He didn't say a word, just strolled into the ring of light thrown off by the fire, picked a log, and sat down. No asking if it was cool, no introductions. Nothing. The three of us just stared at him. It was uncomfortable, that kind of silence that clings to your skin. I could feel the tension in the air as my ex shifted in her seat. When he finally spoke, it was so casual it made my skin crawl. He talked about his day hiking, about the trails he had taken. Felt like small talk, but there was something off about it. His tone was too relaxed, too familiar, like he had known us for years instead of having just appeared out of the trees. The words felt rehearsed, like he had been practicing them over and over. We humored him. What else could we do? There was no rule saying we owned the fire. But as the minutes dragged on, the whole situation felt wrong. The way he sat there, legs spread wide, shoulders slouched back. The way he barely made eye contact but seemed to be watching us all the same. The way he kept scratching his arms, long and slow. He mentioned he was camping nearby, but never said exactly where. I glanced around in the darkness beyond the firelight. I didn't see any other tents or hear any other voices. Just trees, black and endless. At one point, he stopped talking entirely, just stared into the fire, expressionless. The silence stretched. My ex looked at me, eyebrows raised, her friend nervously sipping her drink. We were all waiting for something to happen, something to break the tension. And then he laughed, quietly at first, then louder, a low, breathy sound that didn't match the mood. I felt the hairs on my neck rise. "Well," he finally said, standing up and brushing off his pants, "guess I'll head back." And just like that, he turned and walked back into the woods. No flashlight, no headlamp, just darkness swallowing him up. We sat there for a while, the three of us not saying a word. Eventually, we called it a night. I lay in the tent listening to every rustle, every crack of a twig, every breath of wind against the nylon walls. I barely slept. The next morning, I took a walk through the woods where he had disappeared. I wanted to find his campsite, see where he was staying, but there was nothing. No tent, no fire ring, no sign that anyone had been there. It didn't make sense. We packed up early that day. I didn't tell the girls what I found or didn't find. I didn't want to spook them, but the whole drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just some random camper. It wasn't until later that week that I found out there had been reports of a man approaching people at campsites in the area, acting strangely. There were no details on who he was or where he came from, just that he had made a habit of showing up uninvited. Could have been nothing. Maybe he was just another guy trying to be friendly. But the way he appeared, the way he left, the way he acted, I don't know. I haven't been camping since. It was about 20 years ago when my dad, two of my best friends, their dads, and I went on a camping and canoeing trip down one of the more challenging rivers in our state. It was something we did almost every summer, but this time felt special. We were all a bit older, more confident on the water, and ready to tackle something tougher. My dad had arranged for a guide to meet up with us to help navigate the more advanced parts of the river. At the time, it seemed like a smart decision. The guide was a wiry man in his late 30s or early 40s with shaggy brown hair and a thick beard. He had that kind of quiet demeanor where you couldn't quite get a read on him. I remember he barely made eye contact when he introduced himself. His clothes were worn, like he spent more time in the woods than anywhere else, and he carried a big green duffel bag that seemed oddly heavy for just a few days of camping. The first couple of days were perfect. We spent our mornings paddling down the river and our afternoons fishing. By evening, we were sitting around the campfire, grilling up the day's catch. My friends and I were just kids back then, so we thought it was the coolest thing in the world to be out there, away from everything. We all shared stories, teased each other about who caught the biggest fish, and laughed until our sides hurt. The only one who didn't seem to fit in was the guide. He didn't fish or cook with us. He mostly sat by himself, eating canned fruit and beanie weenies right out of the can. My dad offered him some of our fish once, but he politely declined. I remember thinking it was a little strange, but I figured maybe he just wasn't a social guy. The dads didn't seem too bothered by it either. He was doing his job, after all, guiding us through the trickier parts of the river and making sure we were safe. One night, the temperature dropped more than anyone expected. We hadn't packed for the cold, but we had a small portable heater in our tent. It wasn't much, but it made a difference. As we were all getting ready to turn in, the guide approached my dad and asked if he could sleep in our tent because of the heater. I remember the way he asked, calm but insistent. My dad was polite but firm. He made up an excuse about there not being enough room and offered to share the heater instead. The guide accepted without much pushback, but something about the whole interaction left me with a knot in my stomach. The rest of the trip went by without much incident. We finished our time on the river, said our goodbyes, and headed home. Life moved on. I didn't think much about the guide after that. 5 years later, my dad and I were watching the local news when his face popped up on the screen. I remember feeling my heart stop. There he was, the same wiry man with the thick beard and distant eyes. But this time his name was plastered under the words "child predator captured." I could barely process what I was seeing. The reporter talked about how he had been on the run for years, wanted for multiple counts of child rape. My dad and I just sat there in stunned silence. It hit me like a truck. We had shared meals with him, paddled down the river with him. He had been right there with us, asking to sleep in our tent. I kept replaying every moment I could remember, wondering how close we might have been to something terrible. I thought about the way he avoided eye contact, how he kept to himself, how he had that heavy duffel bag he never let anyone touch. I thought about how vulnerable we had been out there in the woods, miles from anyone else. I can't even describe the mix of emotions I felt. Fear, disbelief, anger. But most of all, I felt lucky. Lucky that my dad had trusted his instincts that night. Lucky that nothing had happened. To this day, I still go camping. I still canoe down rivers and sit around campfires with my friends. But I'm more careful now. I watch people a little more closely. I trust my gut when something feels off. Because sometimes, danger doesn't come with a warning sign. Sometimes, it sits right next to you at the campfire, eating canned fruit while you laugh with your friends. The drive out to the campsite felt like an adventure in itself. We left at the crack of dawn. My girlfriend and I, packed to the brim with camping gear we barely knew how to use. It was her birthday and also our anniversary. A 2-for-1 weekend to get away from the world. We had picked a spot 5 hours from home, a remote place tucked deep into the woods. It was the day after a huge storm had rolled through, leaving the world feeling wet and heavy. The kind of quiet that settles in after a storm is something else. It lingers, hangs thick in the air. When we pulled up to the entrance of the campground, the guy manning the gate smiled and told us we had the whole place to ourselves. No one else was staying there that weekend. I remember we exchanged looks, grinning at the thought. The entire campground to ourselves. We thought it was perfect. The road leading to our site was long and winding. The trees were thick on either side, branches arching overhead, almost blocking out the sun. As we got closer, the road narrowed to a point where turning around became impossible. You had to back out the way you came. It felt a little unsettling, but we shrugged it off. By the time we parked, we were buzzing with excitement. Setting up camp was harder than it looked. We wrestled with the tent for nearly an hour, cursing under our breath until it finally resembled something livable. After that, we decided to explore a little. The woods were thick and eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you realize how much noise the world usually has. Our boots crunched on the damp ground as we walked, breathing in the earthy smell of wet leaves and pine. After a few miles, we stumbled upon a row of small white cabins. They were uniform, almost military-like, lined up in a neat row. No signs, no people, just these silent, pale buildings standing in the woods. We lingered for a moment, but something about the place made my skin crawl. Felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there. We turned back without saying much. When we got back to camp, we tried to start a fire. Neither of us had ever been camping before, and it showed. We had self-lighting logs and lighter fluid, but everything around us was soaked from the storm. Kindling was hard to come by. After a lot of frustration and a few failed attempts, we managed to get a small flame going long enough to roast some hot dogs and marshmallows. We sat in front of the fire, staring up at the stars. The sky was unbelievably dark, the stars impossibly bright. It was beautiful, but the darkness felt oppressive. My girlfriend was tense, glancing over her shoulder every few minutes. Eventually, she asked if we could get into the tent. We put out the fire and crawled inside. The tent felt small and warm, our little bubble of safety. We lay there talking softly, but I could tell she was still on edge. Then she froze, pressing her hand over my mouth. "Do you hear that?" I held my breath. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate. It sounded like a group of people walking slowly through the woods. My heart pounded in my chest. "It's probably just animals," I whispered. Then we heard the mumbling, low, unintelligible. Not words, just the rhythm of speech. It didn't sound like animals. It sounded like people. We stared at each other, frozen. The footsteps got closer, the mumbling louder. It sounded like it was right outside the tent. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might burst. We waited, holding our breath. And then, silence. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I had no idea. My girlfriend finally whispered, "We have to get to the car." Adrenaline surged through me. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and peeked out. Darkness, nothing but trees. I motioned for her to follow me. We ran to the car, my pulse pounding in my ears. I locked the doors as soon as we were inside. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice shaking. "No one is out here but us." What was that? I kept looking around, scanning the woods. Nothing. No movement, no light. Just darkness. I made a decision. "Stay in the car," I said. "I'm going to grab our stuff." I jumped out, heart racing, and grabbed the ice chest. As I tossed it into the back seat, I heard the footsteps again. Closer this time. Heavy, purposeful. My hands shook as I turned back to the tent. I yanked it out of the ground, wrapped the tarp around it in a panic, and slung it over my shoulder. The footsteps were closing in. I shoved the tent into the trunk and jumped into the car. "Do we have everything?" "Yes." I floored it in reverse. The road out was a maze of forks and winding paths. We came to an intersection with 6 different directions. My heart sank. I asked her if she remembered which way we came. She didn't know. We picked a random path and ended up in another campsite. I cursed under my breath and reversed again. From a different angle, I noticed a small sign partially hidden by an overgrown bush, pointed to the main road. Relief flooded me. As we sped down the road, I glanced to my right. Through the trees near where our campsite had been, I saw a small green light, just floating there, steady, unblinking. We drove the full 5 hours back to our hometown without saying much. We crashed on my girlfriend's parents' couch around 4 a.m. Neither of us wanted to talk about it. We never went camping again. Even now, years later, I still wonder what we heard out there. I still think about the footsteps, the mumbling, the green light, and I still have no desire to find out what it was. When I was a kid, camping trips were a big part of our summers. My parents had a caravan, and every year we'd drive out to the same wooded campground near the lake. It wasn't anything fancy, but I loved it. The smell of the campfire, the sound of the trees rustling at night, the way the stars seemed brighter when you were far from town. One summer, my sister and I got it into our heads that we were too grown up to sleep in the caravan. We wanted our own space, and my parents had a small two-person tent they barely used. We begged until they gave in, and that night we set it up right in front of the caravan. It felt like a huge adventure at the time, having our own place to sleep, just a thin layer of fabric separating us from the woods. The first few hours were fine. We sat inside with our flashlights, talking and laughing like it was some big sleepover. We were lying on those old inflatable mattresses that made a squeaky sound every time you shifted. It was warm enough that we left the flap half open to let some air in. From where I lay, I could just barely see the side of the caravan. It made me feel safe knowing our parents were right there. At some point, I must have dozed off. I remember waking up because my sister shook my arm. She didn't have to say anything. I could tell from the look on her face that something was wrong. I listened, and that's when I heard it. Faint, slow rubbing sound, like something brushing against the side of the tent. My heart jumped into my throat. At first, I thought maybe it was the wind, but the air was still. I held my breath and listened harder. The noise came again, this slow, dragging sound, moving along the fabric. It sounded like someone walking around the tent, running their hand along the side as they went. We lay there, frozen. I was too scared to move. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was an animal, but it sounded too deliberate. It didn't come from one spot. It moved, slow and steady, circling the tent. I don't remember how long we stayed like that. Could have been seconds or minutes. Eventually, we must have screamed, or maybe we called out for our parents. I remember my dad coming out of the caravan, shining a flashlight around. I felt a wave of relief as soon as I heard his voice. He walked around the tent, checked the trees nearby, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no broken branches. Just quiet woods and the faint rustle of leaves. We tried to sleep again after that. We really did. But the second time it happened, I thought my heart was going to explode. That same slow, rubbing sound, like someone dragging their hand along the wall. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. Or at least that's what I thought at the time. We didn't make it through the night. We ended up back in the caravan, huddled under the blankets while our parents told us it was nothing, just our imaginations running wild. I wanted to believe them, but I knew what I heard. The next few nights, we refused to sleep in the tent. Even when our parents teased us about it, we didn't care. We weren't going back out there. Finally, my dad gave up and started taking the tent down. That's when we found the tunnels. Some kind of animal had burrowed underneath the tent. Rabbits, maybe, or some kind of rodent. The tunnels ran right under where we'd been sleeping. We never felt it because of the mattresses, but when they moved around down there, they rubbed against the bottom of the tent. That's what we had heard. Not a person, not something creeping through the woods. Just animals. It's funny now. We laughed about it later once the fear wore off. But at the time, we were terrified. I can still remember that feeling. Lying there in the dark with my heart pounding so loud, I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. Sometimes, fear doesn't need to be anything more than your mind filling in the blanks. But when you're in the middle of it, when you're lying in the dark hearing sounds you can't explain, it feels real enough to last a lifetime. We had been planning the trip for weeks, just a weekend away, camping out in the middle of nowhere, North Georgia. Nothing fancy, just some tents, a cooler full of beer, and enough snacks to last us until Sunday. It was supposed to be simple, the kind of trip you take when you just need to clear your head and sit by a fire for a couple of days. We left early on a Friday afternoon. The drive was long but not unbearable, winding through small towns and stretches of trees where the radio cut out completely. It felt good to be out there, away from work and everything else. By the time we reached the tiny grocery store near the campsite, the sun was starting to drop lower in the sky. We pulled into the gravel lot, grabbed some snacks, and headed to the counter to stock up on beer. That's when we found out it was a dry county. Felt like a joke at first. We laughed, asked the cashier if there was anywhere nearby we could buy beer. She didn't laugh with us. She just gave us directions to a place she said was right across the county line, about a 10-minute drive. She called it a bar, but the way she said it felt off. I don't know why I noticed that. We figured, why not? If we couldn't buy beer, we could stop and have a couple before heading to the campsite. We followed the directions she gave us, taking back roads that got narrower and darker the farther we went. There were no street lights out there, just the occasional mailbox or faded sign telling us we were still on the right track. By the time we pulled up, it was almost completely dark. The building didn't look like a bar. It barely looked like a building. No signs, no windows, just brick walls and a single light bulb over a screen door. It was the only light we could see for miles. We sat in the car for a minute, neither of us saying much. I remember making some dumb joke about the movie Deliverance, trying to lighten the mood. My friend laughed, but it didn't feel right. There was something about the place that made my stomach tighten up. I could tell he felt it too. We decided we didn't need a drink that bad. We drove back to the campsite in near silence. The woods felt darker than they should have. I kept checking the rearview mirror like I was expecting to see headlights following us, but there was nothing, just the road stretching back into the dark. The next day, we got to talking with some of the other campers. They seemed like locals, or at least people who had been coming there long enough to know the area better than we did. We mentioned the bar in passing, just another part of the trip we thought was weird enough to laugh about. That's when things got strange. A couple of them, separately, told us the same thing. That place wasn't a bar. It had never been a bar. They looked at us the way you look at someone who almost walked into traffic without realizing it. One of them said they thought we were being lured into trouble. They didn't elaborate, and we didn't ask. The whole thing stuck with me. I kept thinking about how empty that road was, how far out of the way the place seemed. I thought about the way the cashier told us where to go, like it was normal, like it was the kind of thing people did all the time. But it wasn't normal. We left that Sunday without going back to check it out. I don't know what would have happened if we had gotten out of the car that night. Maybe nothing. Maybe we would have had a drink and gone on our way. But I can't shake the feeling that we avoided something bad. Something worse than a couple of guys looking for trouble. I still think about it sometimes when I'm driving at night, about how close we got to stepping out of the car, about the way the woods felt too quiet on the drive back. Sometimes the scariest thing is not knowing what almost happened. I don't know why I picked that spot. Maybe it was the way the trees bent over the clearing like a ceiling, or how the ground felt soft under my boots. I remember thinking it looked secluded, peaceful. Now I wonder if I chose it because no one else would. It was too far off the main trail, too quiet. I set up my tent in the late afternoon. The air smelled damp from the recent rain, and the ground was still dark where the water had pooled. I hammered the stakes in deep, tugged the lines tight, and double-checked everything. It was the kind of place where you plan ahead because you know if something goes wrong, there won't be anyone nearby to help. I liked that about it at first. The woods around me were dense, thick trunks packed so close together that the spaces in between looked almost black, even with the sun still hanging low through the trees. I gathered some wood for a fire and stacked it neatly beside the ring of stones someone had left there before me. I wondered who they were, how long ago they'd sat in this same spot. I found myself looking at the woods a lot more than I needed to. I cooked dinner early just to give myself something to do. I ate it fast and sat there, staring at the fire while the sun dropped lower. The woods got darker in a way that felt sudden, like someone dimmed a switch. I kept catching myself listening. Not for anything in particular, just listening. There was the usual stuff. Wind in the leaves, the occasional creak of a tree, but it felt like I was waiting for something else. I stretched it out as long as I could before crawling into my tent. The sleeping bag felt stiff and cold at first, and I lay there with my headlamp turned off. My breathing sounded loud in the little space. I rolled over a few times, trying to get comfortable, but I was too aware of where I was. Out there in the dark, alone. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up to the sound of something outside. It wasn't loud, just a light rustling. like something moving through the leaves. My heart started pounding hard enough that I could hear it in my ears. I held my breath. The sound stopped. I waited, trying to convince myself it was a raccoon or a deer. Then it started again. Closer. I stayed completely still, listening. It wasn't just the sound of movement. It was slow, deliberate, not the way an animal moves when it's looking for food. More like someone trying not to be heard. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. I reached for my headlamp but stopped. I didn't want to turn it on. I didn't want to see what was out there. The sound circled the tent. Slow, careful steps. Once, twice. I could hear my breathing getting faster, even though I was trying to keep quiet. I thought about calling out, but my throat felt tight. What would I even say? I just lay there, stiff as a board, heart pounding so loud it felt like it was shaking my chest. Then it stopped. I waited, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, barely daring to breathe. I counted the seconds in my head, but nothing happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was gone. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe I imagined how deliberate it sounded. I must have fallen asleep again because the next time I woke up, it was to the feeling of cold air on my face. The tent flap was open. I sat up so fast I felt dizzy. My breath caught in my chest. I shone my headlamp around, but there was nothing there. No sign of anyone. My pack was still where I left it. Nothing was missing. I got out of the tent and shone the light around the clearing. The fire had burned down to coals, and the woods were still. But the ground was different. There were footprints, not boots, bare feet. The dirt was soft from the rain, and they were clear as day. They circled the tent, just like I thought, and then they led off into the trees. I packed up as fast as I could. My hands were shaking the whole time. I kept shining the light into the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. I threw everything into my pack and left the tent stakes behind. I didn't care. I just wanted to be out of there. I made it back to the trail by sunrise. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole way. I know how this sounds. I know how it feels to read something like this and think it was probably nothing, or that I imagined it. I wish I had, but I didn't. I don't know who it was or what they wanted. I just know I was out there, alone, and someone else was too, and they never said a word. I never thought camping could turn bad so fast. I'd been out in the woods dozens of times before. Not an expert or anything, but comfortable enough to handle myself. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. Just me, a tent, some basic gear, and 2 days of peace and quiet away from everything. I picked a spot not far from a small river where the trees thinned out enough to let some sunlight through. Felt right. The ground was dry, the air smelled clean, and there was just enough breeze to keep the bugs away. I pitched my tent, built a fire ring with some rocks, and settled in without a second thought. The first night was fine. I cooked a quick meal on my little camp stove, sat by the fire until it burned down to embers, and crawled into my tent. I remember falling asleep fast. I always sleep better out there, away from the hum of the city. It was the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that feels like a full reset. But when I woke up, something felt off. Not in a dramatic way, just a kind of nagging unease. The kind you can't shake even when there's no reason for it. The air was colder than I expected. My breath hung in the air in small clouds, which didn't make sense because the weather forecast hadn't called for a temperature drop. I tried to brush it off. Weather changes, right? I got the fire going again, made coffee, and tried to let the morning routine settle me down. Didn't. I noticed small things first. My gear wasn't where I left it. My camp chair was a few feet off to the side, not folded up where I left it by the fire. My food bag, which I had hung high from a tree branch to keep critters out, was lower. Not much, but enough that I was sure I hadn't left it that way. I tried to tell myself I was just being forgetful. Maybe I was tired when I set it up. Maybe the rope slipped. But then I found the tracks. At first, I thought they were animal tracks. There were marks in the dirt around my tent, faint but visible. I squatted down and looked closer. They were footprints, not boots, not shoes, bare feet. The dirt was dry, but I could make out the shape of toes, the ball of the foot pressed into the ground. They circled my tent once, maybe twice. They were fresh enough that the edges hadn't crumbled yet. My stomach dropped. I scanned the trees, but there was nothing. Just the same quiet woods, the same breeze shifting the branches. My first thought was that someone was messing with me, maybe another camper having a laugh. But I hadn't seen anyone since I parked my car at the trailhead. I was at least 5 miles from the nearest road. Who would hike out this far just to screw with me? I shook it off, packed a day bag, and decided to take a hike to clear my head. I stuck to a marked trail that looped back toward the river. It was a good few hours of walking. By the time I got back, the sun was dipping low. I was sweaty and tired, but at least I felt normal again, until I saw my camp. My tent was unzipped, not torn open or collapsed, just unzipped. The flaps hung loose, swaying a little in the breeze. I stood there for a long minute, just staring. My first instinct was to yell out, but I didn't. Something about it felt wrong. Yelling would just let whoever it was know I was back. I crept up slow, heart pounding in my chest, and peeked inside. Nothing was missing. My sleeping bag, my pack, everything was right where I left it. But the ground sheet inside the tent was dirty. Not like I had tracked in some mud. It was smudged, smeared with dirt in long streaks like someone had crawled inside. My stomach flipped. I grabbed my gear and moved fast. I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed up in record time, barely stopping to think. As I was breaking down the tent, I heard it. Footsteps, not crashing through the woods, not running. Just slow, steady footsteps, pacing along the tree line behind me. I stopped, held my breath, and listened. The steps stopped when I did. I forced myself to keep moving. I didn't run, but my hands were shaking so bad I could barely get my tent into my pack. As I hoisted it onto my back and started toward the trail, I caught a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision. Movement, just the shape of someone standing half hidden behind the trees, watching me. I didn't wait to get a better look. I walked fast, heart slamming in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I didn't want to panic. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Maybe another camper, maybe someone who thought I was on their spot. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The whole hike back to my car, I heard it. Footsteps, always just far enough behind that I couldn't see who it was. I'd stop, they'd stop. I'd walk, they'd walk. I tried doubling back once, stepping off the trail to circle around. I thought maybe I could catch them, but when I got back to the trail, there was no one there. When I finally made it to my car, I threw my gear in the trunk, got in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a long minute, just breathing. I kept expecting to see someone step out of the woods, but no one ever did. I started the car and drove away. I don't know who it was. I don't know what they wanted, but I haven't been camping since. I've always liked camping. There's something about getting away from everything, the noise, the crowds, the endless grind, that feels like hitting a reset button. No phone buzzing, no emails to answer. Just the woods, a tent, and the sound of the wind moving through the trees. This time, I picked a spot way out in the state forest. No marked sites, no other campers. Just a clearing by a small lake about 10 miles down an old logging road. The kind of place you only find by accident or if you've been there before. I had been once, years ago. I remembered it being peaceful, quiet. It was late fall. The air had that sharp bite to it, and the leaves were mostly down, covering the ground in a thick layer of reds and browns. I got there around noon, set up my tent, gathered some wood, and got a fire going. It was one of those perfect afternoons. Clear sky, just cold enough to make you appreciate the warmth of the fire. I spent the day fishing by the lake, caught a couple of small trout, and cooked them up for dinner. As the sun started to dip below the tree line, the light turned that deep golden color, making the woods look like something out of a painting. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have the place all to myself. But as the light faded, that feeling started to shift. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a sense that something was off. I figured it was the quiet, Out there, once the sun goes down, it gets real quiet. No distant hum of traffic, no voices carrying from other campsites. Just the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of something moving through the leaves. I sat by the fire for a while, poking at the coals and staring out into the dark. The trees pressed in close around the clearing, their branches black against the dim sky. My headlamp cast a pale circle of light, but beyond that was just shadow. That's when I first noticed it. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere in the woods behind me. I turned, shining my light toward the trees. Nothing, just the bare trunks and the thick carpet of leaves. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe. They make a lot of noise when they move through the woods, but something about it felt wrong. Too slow, too steady. I sat back down trying to shake it off, but I couldn't. I kept listening, straining to hear past the crackle of the fire. And then I heard it again, closer this time. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and started walking toward the sound. I figured if it was an animal, I'd scare it off. But as I got closer to the tree line, the sound stopped. I stood there for a minute, shining my light through the trees. Nothing. I went back to the fire, but I couldn't relax. My eyes kept drifting toward the woods. I was jumpy. Every little sound made my heart kick up. The night felt heavier, darker. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and lay there in the dark, listening. It took me a long time to fall asleep. When I woke up, it was still dark. The kind of dark where you can't see your hand in front of your face. I checked my watch, 3:17 a.m. Something had woken me up. I wasn't sure what. Then I heard it. The footsteps. Slow, heavy, right outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat. I lay there, frozen, my heart pounding so hard I thought whoever, or whatever, was out there would hear it. The footsteps circled the tent, moving slowly, deliberately, leaves crunching underfoot. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Animals don't move like that. They don't circle your tent in the middle of the night. I reached slowly for the knife I kept by my sleeping bag. My hand was shaking so bad I could barely hold it. I waited, listening. The footsteps stopped. I lay there, heart pounding, for what felt like forever. Finally, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint orange glow across the clearing. There was nothing there. I waited, watching, until the cold started to seep into my bones. I kept telling myself it was my imagination, that maybe I had dreamed the whole thing. But I didn't go back to sleep. As the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I felt exposed, like I was being watched. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, or something, standing at the edge of the woods. On the hike back to my truck, I noticed something I hadn't seen on the way in. Footprints, big ones, human. They followed the trail for a while, then veered off into the woods. I never camped there again. Camping trips are supposed to be about unwinding, enjoying the outdoors, and spending time with friends. That was the plan when my girlfriend and I went on this trip with some new friends a few years back. It was supposed to be a fun, laid-back weekend. Instead, it turned into one of the most unsettling experiences I've ever had. We had everything set up well in advance. My girlfriend and I would share a tent, and the two friends we came with would share another. But one of them, let's call him Mike, suddenly decided he needed his own tent. He said he sleepwalked and didn't want to freak anyone out. I was irritated because we had already worked out the sleeping arrangements, but I tried to let it go. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it and ruin the trip before it even started. Still, it put a weird vibe in the air. The first part of the day was pretty normal. We set up camp, cooked some food, and hung out around the fire until it got late. Everyone seemed to be having a good time, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Mike was acting a little off. He was quieter than usual, a little twitchy. I just chalked it up to him being tired or something. We called it a night, and my girlfriend and I headed to our tent. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to my girlfriend shaking me. She whispered, "Mike is freaking me out." I sat up, still half asleep, and looked outside the tent. Sure enough, Mike was out there, just walking in circles around the campsite. He wasn't stumbling like someone who was sleepwalking. He was walking with purpose, head down, pacing the same loop over and over. It was unsettling, but I figured maybe he really was sleepwalking. I told her we just needed to keep an eye on him and make sure he didn't hurt himself. That theory went out the window about 30 seconds later. Out of nowhere, Mike stopped walking, tilted his head back, and started screaming, "Hello!" at the top of his lungs. It was one of the loudest, most unhinged sounds I've ever heard. Not just a yell, but a desperate, panic scream. My girlfriend and I just sat there, frozen. It wasn't the kind of scream you could ignore. It sounded like he was losing his mind. The other guy we were camping with must have woken up because I saw his tent rustling. None of us said anything. We were all just watching Mike scream into the night. Then, just as suddenly as he started, he stopped. The silence was somehow worse. Mike stood there for a moment, breathing hard. Then he turned toward the woods, raised his arm, and I realized he was holding a pistol. I hadn't even known he had brought a gun. My heart dropped. He pointed it into the darkness, and with a shaky voice, screamed, "Hello!" again. That was the moment I realized how dangerous this situation could get. I grabbed my own gun from my bag. I didn't want to use it, but if he started firing randomly, I wanted to be ready. My girlfriend was clutching my arm, shaking. Neither of us dared to make a sound. Mike kept his gun raised for what felt like an eternity, then slowly lowered it, walked back to his tent, and went to sleep like nothing had happened. The next morning, I confronted him about it. I needed to know what the hell that was all about. He claimed he wasn't sleepwalking. He said he thought he heard coyotes and wanted to scare them off. Couldn't believe it. Instead of waking any of us up or letting us know what was going on, he decided to wander around screaming with a loaded gun in the middle of the night. I told him flat out that I wasn't comfortable camping with him again. He didn't seem to care. A couple of years later, I saw his name on the news. He had been arrested for causing a panic at another campground. Apparently, he had been running through the woods, firing his gun into the dark, screaming that he was chasing Bigfoot. It hit me how close we might have come to something worse that night. I haven't been able to look at camping the same way since. It wasn't the idea of something lurking in the woods that scared me. It was the person standing right next to me. We had driven out to the campground late that afternoon, the sun dipping low over the horizon as we pitched our tent in a quiet corner of the grounds. There were maybe 5 other campers spread out across the area, but they were far enough away that it felt like we had the place to ourselves. It was one of those perfect early summer evenings, the air still warm but cooling off just enough to justify a fire. My girlfriend and I sat outside the tent for hours, poking at the flames with sticks, listening to the crackle of wood, and watching the smoke drift lazily upward into the night. By the time we decided to call it a night, the fire was down to embers, and the woods had gone deathly quiet. You could hear the occasional rustle of leaves or the faint hoot of an owl, but mostly it was just that heavy, oppressive silence you only get when you're far from civilization. We climbed into our sleeping bags and let the stillness lull us to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, the kind of groggy, half-aware wakefulness where you aren't sure why you opened your eyes until it hits you all at once. I was awake because I heard something. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and close, maybe 20 feet from our tent. I could feel my heart pick up immediately, pounding against my ribs as I lay there, holding my breath. I turned my head slightly and saw my girlfriend lying perfectly still. I could tell by the way she was breathing that she was awake too. The footsteps continued, steady but oddly hesitant. They weren't moving around much, just a few steps, then a pause. A few more steps, another pause. There was something unsettling about how it sounded. Not heavy enough to be a large animal. No breathing noises. It sounded like a person, but something about the rhythm was off, like they weren't quite sure where they were going. We lay there for what felt like an eternity, both of us too scared to move. I kept waiting for the sound to trail off, for the footsteps to fade into the distance. But they didn't. They just stopped. Not in a way that suggested the person had left. There were no departing steps, no crunch of leaves moving away, just silence. 1 second they were there, the next they weren't. We waited. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, nothing. My heart was still racing, and every little rustle of the wind through the trees made me flinch. We whispered briefly, barely audible, agreeing to wait it out. I kept telling myself it was just another camper, someone wandering around in the dark, lost or drunk or confused. But why hadn't they kept walking? Why stop so close to our tent? Eventually, after what must have been an hour, exhaustion overtook fear and I fell asleep. When we woke up the next morning, the campsite was bathed in bright sunlight, the eerie feeling of the night before almost laughable in the daylight. We stepped out of the tent and walked the perimeter, half expecting to find footprints or some obvious sign of someone having been there. The ground was mostly dry, with soft patches of dirt where tracks would be easy to spot. There was nothing. We asked a few of the other campers as we passed them later that morning if they'd been walking around at night. Nobody had. One guy joked that we must have been dreaming, but I could tell by the way my girlfriend looked at me that we both knew better. We had both heard it. We packed up later that day and drove home, trying to brush it off as just one of those weird, unexplainable things that happen when you're out in the woods. But even now, years later, I still think about it sometimes. About how those footsteps stopped so suddenly, with no trace of where they went. Maybe it was just another camper. Maybe it was an animal that sounded human. Maybe there's some perfectly reasonable explanation I haven't thought of. But when I lie in bed at night, thinking back to that eerie silence, I still can't shake the feeling that something was standing out there in the dark, just watching us. It was the kind of fall weekend that begged to be spent outdoors. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. My buddies and I had been planning this camping trip for weeks. We set up camp in the thick woods near the base of the mountains, the kind of place where the trees stretch so high they nearly block out the sun. On the second day, my buddy and I decided to head out for a hike to scout for elk since hunting season was opening up next month. It was early morning, the kind where frost still clings to the grass and your breath fogs in front of you. He carried his 2-year-old daughter in one of those backpack carriers, bundled up in a tiny beanie, and we had a couple of dogs running ahead of us, sniffing every branch and puddle. The woods were peaceful. The only sounds were the crunch of our boots, the occasional bark from the dogs, and the distant rustle of wildlife. We made our way through the trees, winding along old trails until we eventually came out onto a 2-track road. It was one of those rough, unpaved paths mostly used by hunters and loggers. The sun had risen a bit higher by then, casting long shadows across the road. We walked side by side, about 10 feet apart. The dogs trotted ahead, tails wagging, and my buddy's daughter was dozing off in the carrier. We weren't saying much, just enjoying the quiet of the woods. Then, out of nowhere, the crack of a rifle split the air. There was that sickening, unmistakable whiz of a bullet passing between us. It wasn't a distant shot. It was close, way too close. My heart stopped for a second, and I froze in place. My buddy spun around, instinctively grabbing at his daughter. The dogs yelped and darted back toward us. Panic hit me like a punch to the chest. I bolted up the road toward the clearing just ahead, screaming at whoever was out there. My voice echoed through the trees. "Stop shooting. There are people here." As I cleared the tree line, I saw him. He was standing in the middle of the clearing with a rifle in his hands, looking dumber than a box of rocks. He wasn't wearing blaze orange, wasn't paying attention. My mind raced. He wasn't bird hunting, not with a rifle. Who the hell bird hunts with a rifle? Adrenaline was still pounding in my ears. My hands were shaking as I pulled my pistol, holding it down by my side but ready. My voice came out raw, heart pounding as I told him he had almost shot us. His excuses tumbled out, none of them making sense. He kept pointing at the trees, talking about how he thought he saw something. I was seeing red. Couldn't believe it. This guy was out here, taking random shots into the woods with no thought about who or what might be on the other side. He had a kid with him too, standing near his truck. What the hell was he thinking? Things got heated fast. My buddy was behind me now, trying to calm me down, reminding me we had kids here too. I took a breath, trying to steady myself, but the guy wasn't backing down. He started running his mouth, getting defensive. At one point, he even threatened me, saying he'd find me in town. It was so absurd it was almost laughable, but I wasn't laughing. It wasn't just about me. It was about my buddy's kid, our dogs, all of us. Finally, my buddy pulled me aside. The guy grabbed his stuff and left, muttering the whole way back to his truck. We stood there for a while after he drove off, just staring at the empty clearing. The forest was quiet again, but not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind where your skin crawls. We decided to head back to camp, the mood completely different now. Neither of us said much on the way back. The dogs stayed close, tails down. My buddy kept adjusting the straps on the carrier, checking on his daughter. Back at camp, we sat by the fire, still trying to make sense of what had happened. I kept replaying it in my head. The crack of the rifle, the sound of that bullet cutting through the air right between us. How close it had been. How it could have been a hell of a lot worse. A few days later, we packed up and headed home. I kept thinking about the guy's words. "I'll find you in town." It was ridiculous, but it stuck with me. I kept looking over my shoulder for a while after that, especially when I was out in the woods. I guess that's the thing about an experience like that. It doesn't just stay in the past. It gets under your skin. I still go camping. I still hunt. But I keep my head on a swivel now. It's not the bears or the coyotes you worry about. It's the people. The ones you don't see coming until it's almost too late.